But lest we make that mistake, let's not overlook this wonderful, beautiful story of love. It's a love story in more ways than one. So let's hear this word of God today. There was a man named Elimelech from a little place called Bethlehem, in a tribe called Judah. And Elimelech traveled with his wife Naomi and his 2 sons to the land of Moab on the southeastern side of the Dead Sea, because there was a famine in Judah and his home area. And out of desperation, he moved to the land of Moab. Now Moab had its foundations. It was a country whose foundations had its roots in Abraham's nephew Lot, who had you were asking me if I was going, praying I wouldn't be boring today. Okay. So Lot fathered the people of Moab through an incestuous relationship with his daughter, who got him drunk and had sex with him and fathered a child. That was the beginnings of Moab. Okay, so if you thought the Bible was boring, you have not been paying attention. But anyway, Moab was also a land that when Israel was coming out of Egypt and they were trying to make their way through the wilderness to enter into the promised land, the land of the Canaanites, Moab would not provide them passage. Moab opposed them. And the king of Moab tried to have a curse placed upon them. So there was tension between the Israelites and the Moabites for a lot of different reasons. Moabites were, generally speaking, not to be allowed to be a part of the assembly of Israel as Israel gathered. They were banned. So here are these Israelites in the days of the judges, where these people were basically in the midst of chaos and confusion most of the time. And it was a time, as we saw last week, the time of the judges was a time characterized by rebellion and apostasy, repeatedly so, over and over again. And in the time of the judges, it tells us that they all did what was right in their own eyes, because there was no king to teach them, to guide them, to lead them, a faithful king. But anyway, in the last parts of those days, we come to this story of this family, Elimelech and his family, and what will become his daughter-in-law, especially Ruth. There was another daughter-in-law involved. But when Naomi and Elimelech went to the land of Moab, Elimelech suddenly died unexpectedly and left Naomi a widow. And her 2 sons remained, and after 10 years in the land of Moab, because of this famine that they were experiencing in Israel, after 10 years, her 2 sons died. Now, for a woman to be left without a husband and without sons in those days especially, but even today, most places in the world, is a very, very dire and vulnerable situation. And Naomi, in so many ways, was feeling lost and feeling left and feeling left out and feeling forgotten, that God was against her. Have you ever felt like that? She was feeling like she was empty and bitter because of the hardships that she was facing. But she decided, because she got word that things were better in her home area, that she was just going to go back home. And this is where we're going to pick up here in chapter 1, verse 6. It says, Then she, Naomi, arose with her daughters-in-law, that would be Orpah and Ruth, to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from that place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, and go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter for me, for your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." And then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. This is the word of God for us, the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. My grandmother on my dad's side was Mary Wall, Grandma Wall. I called her Nanny. And she was a grandmother who actually lived to be, 93 years old and died when I was 20 years old. Now, all of my other grandparents on my mom's side and my dad's side, my dad's dad, he died before I was ever born. And my mom's parents, they died shortly after I was born, so I really didn't get to know them. I do have some remembrances of them, but I didn't really get to know them. But I had two wonderful grandmothers, I know that. And my Grandma Wall, as I probably have shared with you before, one of the things I remember about her most was that she was a snuff dipper. She loved to dip snuff. She dipped a special kind of snuff called Navy. Now, the difference between my Grandma Wall and my Grandma Boyles was not just their last names. Grandma Wall dipped Navy snuff, and Grandma Boyles dipped Tube Rose. They both were snuff dippers. And Grandma Wall, she had this little stick off of a black gum tree. And she would make the end of it real fine so she could put it in her mouth, get a little wet, and dip it in that snuff can and stick it in her mouth. Okay, and she'd be sitting there, I can see her now, sitting there in that rocking chair with that little stick sticking out of her mouth as she was dipping her snuff and spitting into her little spit can there beside of her rocking chair. I remember always when I had to be at her house, I would have to be careful using the phone over there, because when she talked on the phone, to get caught up on what was going on in the neighborhood, she'd be dipping her snuff and it'd blow out onto the phone with it a little bit wet, and it'd get caked on. It was like brown all over this receiver on this little black phone she had there on her desk. So I'd call somebody from there. If I had to call home or something, I'd hold the phone out here. "I can't really hear you. I can't." But anyway, that's not the only thing I remember about Grandma Wall. The other thing I remember about Grandma Wall was that as she would sit there in that rocking chair, there were times where I would go over there in the evening, and I'd spend the night with her sometimes. And she would have me help her do stuff around the house, out in the garden or whatever. And I'd be sitting there with her at night. And sometimes there would be times, about this time of year, there would be Billy Graham crusades coming on TV. Grandma Wall would always watch those Billy Graham crusades, and she would talk to me about faith and talk to me about belief in Jesus. And she was a prominent member in our home church, and she was kind of quirky, and she was known to be kind of a quirky person who would just kind of just tell you like it was and tell you what she was thinking. But she loved Jesus more than she loved her Navy snuff, I can tell you that. She was a woman who loved the Lord, and she wanted to pass on her faith to me. Now, if I'm going to tell right now, my kids are sitting here listening to this story about Grandma Wall, it's their great-grandma. They obviously never got to meet her. But what we're reading today in the book of Ruth is a story about a great-great-grandma. That's what this book is about. It's introducing us to this woman who was a great-great-grandma and a very important person, and a person who was of questionable heritage, and because of where she came from, she was of questionable character. Yet she clung to her mother-in-law, and she committed herself not only to the well-being of her mother-in-law, but she committed herself to her mother-in-law Naomi's God, as she committed to go back with her to the land of Bethlehem and Judah. And they were women who were very vulnerable as they traveled and even as they settled, especially in those days, because it was not days known for its faithfulness and for its faithful people. So they were going to be at the mercy of people who would be possibly or not possibly willing to help them. So they're traveling back to the land of Judah. And there, in desperation, Ruth begins to go to a landowner named Boaz, who just happens to be, as far as her mother-in-law is concerned, a next of kin to them, a person who was close in relationship to them. And she goes and she has to rely on the goodness of Boaz. And in these days, whether people would actually do what they were supposed to help the poor or not, that was uncertain. And a lot of times during the life of Israel, even though the law told Israel how to take care of each other and how to take care of the poor, oftentimes people ignored it so often. And that's a lot of what the prophets would challenge people about and call people to repent of, is their neglect of the poor and how they took advantage of the poor. Really, this story, if you understand what's going on here, we looked at Leviticus 19 a few weeks ago. And in Leviticus 19, there's a section there that talks about how we're to love our neighbors as we love who? Ourselves, right? And we're to love our neighbors. And in the context of that story, it tells us how to do that. It tells us that in order to love our neighbors, we're to care for our neighbors when they're in need. And the way that they were to do that in that day and time is that the local landowners and the farmers would leave part of the crops in their field, the corners and the gleanings in their field for the poor, so that the poor's needs can be met in terms of food. And they were supposed to do that not only for the native Israelites, but also for foreigners. A lot of times those would be the original inhabitants of Canaan, or from people like Moab, like this woman named Ruth. So we're reminded all throughout the book of Ruth that Ruth was a Moabite. She was a Moabite. She was this outsider who had become a part of the family of Naomi. And we also see another aspect of the law here being fulfilled when they had to rely on, in this day and time, these are practices that sound strange to us. But the principle shouldn't, okay? The practice may be strange, but the principle shouldn't. The practice was that if a woman was left widowed, that her next of kin, if possible, would marry her and then, if possible, have children with her. But those children would actually carry the name not of the immediate husband, but of the deceased husband. That sounds weird, doesn't it? But the principle behind it is this. The principle was to keep families strong and to keep families going. To keep families strong, to keep families going, and to continue the family line. There was also a practice of redemption of the fields or the property, the land that families would own. If they had to sell it because of dire situations or poverty, there was provision made where that land eventually could revert back to the original family. So there's right from the get-go in the Word of God and the law of God, there's this principle to empower local communities and to strengthen and to stabilize families in order to benefit and provide for the greater good of the rest of the society. Now I know, we hear stuff, crazy, stupid stuff a lot of times today from preachers and people who write so-called Christian works and stuff that tell us stuff like rules get in the way of relationship. It should just be all about relationship and We shouldn't worry about rules or be concerned with rules. I was watching this movie the other night, and even in that movie, they were talking about boundaries and how all boundaries are just made up conventions of people. Like we just make them up, there's no real boundaries in life. And the goal of life is to just abolish all boundaries of life. That's a lot of what's going on today. So people feel like that rules are just get in the way and keep us from having the freedom that we really should have. But here, the fact that the rules were obeyed, the fact that the law was obeyed, led to the blessing of these relationships, because Boaz was faithful to his duties. He was faithful to his obligations under the law. So as Ruth goes to glean from his fields to provide the sustenance that she and Naomi are going to need, she also eventually slips in at night while he's sleeping. And she slips in, and the Bible tells us she uncovers his feet. Now there's, people want to read all kinds of, stuff into that's not really there. But she was trying to get his attention, and she was trying to make a proposition to him. This was a bold move on the part of Ruth, as she was encouraged by her mother-in-law, Naomi. She was going to propose marriage. Now, even today, for a woman to propose marriage would be, a little bit unusual. Not that unusual, maybe as it was then, but it was incredibly unusual then. But it was out of desperation, and she asked Boaz to become her kinsman redeemer and the kinsman redeemer for her family, where he would take on this responsibility and bear children through her that would carry on the family name of a man named Elimelech, Naomi's husband. Okay, to keep that family strong. So Boaz, at first, he says, well, there's this other guy who's in line before me. He's actually closer kin than me. See, the responsibility to help people was placed on the local community, but first and foremost, on the immediate family. That's a principle you see right here. That's playing out. This is what you see all throughout the whole Bible, is this principle. So, Boaz, once he finds out that this other guy doesn't want to keep that commitment, he decides to keep that commitment himself, and he marries this woman named Ruth. Remember, she's a Moabite. He marries Ruth. And together they begin to have children together. So the law keeps pointing us, the law of God keeps pointing us to the strengthening of families, and that trajectory gets stronger and stronger as you go all the way through the Bible. And this is something we can't take for granted. This is what I want to share with you today. This is something very important, because we have been so duped, and we don't even realize it, that there have been people who have intentionally set out throughout the last 150 years or so, and even longer, but especially in our culture in the last 150 years or so, it hasn't been accidental. They've intentionally set out to undermine the strength and the stability of families. And they've done it. And we've all been affected by it. We've all succumbed to it in so many different ways, okay? There's a guy named Karl Marx. A lot of people haven't heard of him. Ian, my son, had a teacher at one time who said, that Karl Marx was just misunderstood. And Ian was asking me about it one night. I said, well, this is the deal. Back in the 1870s, Karl Marx was an atheist who despised Christianity. Fact. Karl Marx was a person who also set out intentionally to undermine and to destroy the family, and also the church. It wasn't accidental. He did it intentionally. He was the founder and the father of what became socialism, and socialism was designed to lead to communism. Okay? And part of what they were trying to do was they intentionally, and this is being done on steroids today, they intentionally promoted promiscuity. They intentionally promoted what they called free love, even in the 1800s, okay, in order to destroy and undermine marriage and the family, because they knew that if to get the vision of the society that he wanted, he would have to destroy the family and the church. But that's the trajectory that the Bible actually establishes, is the strength and the stability of families for the blessing of society. And that's what we see right here. You know, people talk about, hey, I'm going to change the world. I'm all about social justice and all of these kinds of things. And they're out to change the world by promoting all of these kinds of ideas. And the greatest thing that we could do, according to Mother Teresa, if we want to change the world, there's one simple thing that we should start with. And she said, love your family. Love your family. How revolutionary. That is the greatest thing that we can do for social justice today, is do everything in our power to stabilize and to strengthen families and local communities. We've been duped. We don't even realize it. With the things that we're bombarded with day in and day out, those are not accidents. The stuff that you get bombarded with on the internet, the stuff that you get bombarded with on social media and on television, some of the shows that come on, it's incredible what's going on today. And we have been duped, and we're continuing to be duped over and over and over again. But here is just kind of an inkling of what God is working to do in society and through these relationships. And it was commitment to these principles that we're talking about that saved Naomi, and that saved Ruth, and it saved their family. And what Naomi once thought was bitterness turned to joy. And what Naomi once thought of as just emptiness turned to the fullness of God and the fullness of God's blessing on her life. She went from a person of a very, very desperate situation to a person of great honor in the history of Israel. Naomi and her daughter, Ruth. Boaz and Ruth got married, and they began to have a family. They began to have children. And it's very, very important. It tells us here that Ruth was the great-great-grandmother at the end of the book of Ruth. She was the great-great-grandmother of a man who would be born named David. And David would become a king, and not just any king. He would become a great king of Israel, and God would make a very special promise to him. Okay, the promises of God. We talk about the promises of God, but a lot of times we don't even know what we're talking about. Okay? We've been talking a lot about the promise God made to Abraham. We've talked about the promise God made to Israel, about the new covenant. Here's a promise that God made to David. And his great-great-grandmother was Ruth. And the promise was this, that David would have a descendant to sit on his throne forever. Now when we get to Matthew chapter 1, have I ever told y'all that the storyline is in the family line? We get to this genealogy. And it begins out by saying, Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. There are 5 women who were mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in chapter 1. There's a woman named Tamar who tricked her father-in-law into having sex with her so she could get pregnant, as she dressed as pretended to be a prostitute. That's in Genesis. Her father-in-law was Judah, who was also of the tribe. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. And then you also have, we've already come across this other person, a prostitute by the name of Rahab. So, think about this now. Rahab was a Canaanite prostitute in the city of Jericho. And she committed herself to Israel and to the God of Israel, and she helped to save the spies of Israel. And she became a part of the family of Israel after the Israelites took over and destroyed Jericho. And then we have this woman named Ruth, who was of questionable heritage, being a Moabite, a foreigner, country that was a result of this incestuous relationship. And she was a questionable character because of that. She was a very faithful person. She was a very godly person. She was a very committed person. But she was of questionable pedigree, to say the least. And then the other woman who was mentioned in Jesus' genealogy, aside from his mother Mary at the end, is a woman named Bathsheba. Now, who was Bathsheba? Well, she was the wife of a Canaanite, a Hittite, by the name of Uriah. And she was basically in an adulterous relationship, maybe against her will, with the king who would become King David later. And Ruth was the great-great-grandmother of that king. Now, I say all of that and mention all of those women that say this. They were all misfits. Everybody in those genealogy, even Judah and all the other characters, they're all misfits. They're all mess-ups. They're all a bunch of sinners. Okay? But what that genealogy tells us is that by faith Rahab, and by faith Ruth, and by faith all of these other characters, even though they were of questionable character, they had a place in the family of God. Pretty cool, huh? And if they've got a place in the family of God, there's hope for all of us other mess-ups.
I got my t-shirt on.
You got your t-shirt on.
What says God's misfit?
God's misfits. Perfect shirt for today. Because that's all that you have in the family of God, except for one person, and there's only one person, and all of those genealogies, all those beget, that you come across in all of the Bible, there's only one, right? Who wasn't a mess up, and who wasn't a misfit, and who wasn't a mutt, even if you will, and his name is Jesus. So even in the genealogies, and that's what we're reading family history here. We're reading about great-great-grandma Ruth. She was the great-great-grandma of King David, but she was also the great-great-great-great-great-grandma of King Jesus. And spiritually, she's our great-great-grandma too. So it's important for us to know there was a place for her in the family of God. There was a place for Rahab in the family of God. There's a place for you and me, praise God, in the family of God. Because the family of God is not about a genealogy of geniuses. It's about a family of faith. And God can take those who are of questionable character like you and me, those who are of questionable heritage like you and me, and make us a part of the faithful few. It's being part and members of the family of God, all by the grace of God, and all through faith, and faith alone. So Ruth is an important book. It's a transitional book between Judges and Samuel and other parts of the story. See, one of the biggest lies that's being told over and over again today is like the Bible's just this incoherent story. It's all these incoherent stories that just kind of thrown together and they don't really fit together, and it's just full of contradictions and just full of all kinds of paradoxes and stuff because of the contradictions and stuff like that. Like it's just a random bunch of collection of stories. But you got to see by now how big of a lie that really is. We've been duped in more ways than one. There have been people that set out because of their ideology, because of people like Karl Marx, to not only undermine family, to not only undermine the church, but also to undermine the Bible, which is our history book. It's our family history book. Aren't you glad to be a part of the family of God today? It's a place for all of us. Misfits, mess-ups,